Hello, Beat Check listeners. I'm Shane Dixon Kavanaugh, Portland City Hall reporter for the Oregonian OregonLive, and your host this week. Joining me today is Ted Sickinger, a longtime investigative and watchdog reporter in our newsroom. He's graciously accepted my invitation to talk a bit about his recent deep dive into how Portland's big promise to crack down on unlicensed Airbnbs in the city went bust. Ted, thanks so much for your time and welcome to the show.
Thanks, Shane. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Let's just start off and set the scene here a little bit. Talk to me some about why a place like Portland should be regulating or looking to regulate short-term rentals in the first place.
Yeah, there's a variety of reasons. One that has been expressed over and over again by city council members and others is safety. I mean, you just don't want people coming to town, excuse me, and staying in places that aren't licensed for habitation. You want these rentals to have proper egress, entrance, and exits in case of fire or some natural disaster. And you want them to be properly equipped with smoke and carbon monoxide detectors. And again, these are requirements that commercial hotels and bed and breakfasts all have, and we don't want this big piece of the kind of vacation rental market to go without those same things. Obviously, we have an ongoing housing emergency, and short-term rentals take properties off the market that otherwise might be available to local residents for long-term rentals. Some studies suggest that in areas with a concentration of short-term rentals, platforms like Airbnb have an effect similar to gentrification, displacing lower income and vulnerable residents. And of course, there are livability issues. There's noise, there's extra traffic, parking, and trash. Vacationers can be pretty rowdy, and if you pack too many commercial vacation rentals into these, residential districts that we so love in Portland, it changes their character, and it impacts livability for long-term residents.
So, what exactly happened with the city and Airbnb in 2019? This appears to be sort of a critical point in time and serves basically as the basis for what got you interested in this investigation to begin with.
Yeah. So I don't want to make this a long wind up to this, but it's important to understand some of the backdrop to how the changes came about in 2019. When Airbnb first started up in Portland prior to 2014, it really took off, but it was essentially completely unregulated, and Portlanders quickly listed hundreds and eventually thousands of rentals on the platform. And by 2014, there was a bunch of pressure on City Hall to change that. Neighborhood groups were concerned about livability and safety. Tenants advocates worried about the impact on housing supply. The city was very interested in collecting the lodging tax revenues that could come in off of these things. So in 2014, the city council adopted rules requiring operators to obtain a permit, to undergo an inspection, to limit the numbers of rooms they rented, and to live in their rental properties at least 9 months a year. So that sounded like a pretty tough set of rules, but in reality, Airbnb and a bunch of the other platforms refused to share their bookings and host data. They denied any responsibility for policing and unpermitted listings on their site. So the city had really no means of enforcing rules or ensuring that hosts paid all the lodging taxes that they owed. In 2018, the city auditor came out with a first of a series of audits looking at the market and these platforms, and it determined that there are about 4,600 listings on Airbnb, and 80% of them were unlicensed. They found enforcement of the rules was lax, that the city had no real idea what the effect of these were on the housing market. So finally, in 2019, and this followed a court case in Santa Monica over this issue of data sharing, Portland adopted a new ordinance giving the short-term rental platforms a choice. They could either agree not to collect bookings from hosts that weren't registered in the city's licensing database, um, or they could agree to share host data and transaction data with the city. And Airbnb chose the latter option, and it signed a memorandum of understanding, this data sharing agreement, with the city. And that was kind of a big deal at the time, and city officials, sort of crowed about the fact that this was the toughest set of regulations in the country. Um, and what the deal required was that Airbnb set up a registration system that allowed hosts to immediately list and operate their their rentals on the platform. They'd forward that information. Airbnb would forward their information to the city, and the city then would email an application packet to the host. If the host didn't apply for a proper permit within 60 days, the city could then tell Airbnb to remove the listing. In the interim, and again, this is one of the issues that's become a big deal, is that while the city was processing the permit, the host could operate their rental under a pending status. Meanwhile, Airbnb was sharing transaction data, which presumably has allowed revenue to police the listings and make sure that it's getting its transient lodging taxes and fees coming in. So that was kind of you are still required to get a license, one of two kinds: a type A for 2 bedrooms or less, or 5 guests or less, or a type B, which is a larger rental, and that comes with a land use review that the city completes, and that's an involved process. It's $7,700 to get one. You have to put in a traffic study that's cost people $4,000. Most people use a consultant, and I was told by several hosts that this process can cost people $15,000 to license to license a larger rental.
And so, why was this data sharing agreement that the city reached with Airbnb so widely ballyhooed at the time?
Well, I think the Bureau of Development Services folks and Revenue felt like if they had this data in hand, they would be able to enforce, you know, the occupancy limits and the permits, the fact that you had a permit at all, and that, again, that this sort of Wild West scenario that we had, they would have all that data in front of them, and they could force people to license their listings and comply with some of the other requirements that they had put in place, like the residency requirement, and the limits on the number of bedrooms that you're allowed to to rent. And I think, at the time in city council, again, everyone was very optimistic that this was going to, operate very smoothly going forward.
So, fast forward 4 years, and would you say that with regard to short term rentals in Portland, are we still in sort of a Wild West setting, so to speak?
We are. I mean, the whole system is a mess at this point. Um, Among the things that we found in looking at this is that many Airbnbs are still unlicensed. The company at this point has about Airbnb has 3,700, 3,800 short-term rentals in Portland, for less than 30 days, which are those subject to these regulations. But there are only about 830 rental units with a current valid permit across all the platforms. Um, and that's, again, back in this short-term rental registry, which is important moving forward. We found that the city has a massive backlog of nearly 1,700 pending applications and renewals across sort of all the short-term rental platforms. And if you go in, you can look at this in the Portland Maps data that some of our listeners may be familiar with. And if you get into the underlying data, most or many of these are years old. These pendings and renewals, and even the currently permitted one, they haven't been renewed, um, and they aren't valid, but they're in that registry, and so regulators consider them in compliance. And you can still list those properties without a completed application or a permit, much less this sort of land use review that some of the other larger properties are supposed to go through. We also found that the data sharing agreement itself is broken. Um, the city, BDS, Bureau of Development Services, excuse my shorthand.
For listeners, Bureau of Development Services is the code enforcement agency with the city of Portland. They handle permitting and also regulations around nuisance properties and noise complaints and things of that nature. So,
Correct. So anyway, the Bureau of Development Services hasn't been able to even access this data for 15 months. So they have no idea how many new hosts have registered listings with Airbnb, where those properties are. They blame a software problem, but they haven't been able to sort of explain exactly what this is. There's kind of a technical API key that they're supposed to, that is broken. So they haven't been able to access that. They put in a request to fix it back in May of 2022, but that wasn't prioritized, and no fix has been forthcoming. Um, so they haven't been able to send out any new permit applications to operators of new listings since, again, May of 2022. The city also, as part of that data sharing agreement, abandoned safety inspections for a lot of short-term rentals. And that was at the time in order to expedite the permitting process. And they adopted rules at the time that they were going to inspect 10% of newly permitted listings each year. Since 2019, they've conducted 14 safety inspections. Um, the enforcement of the regulations is completely lax. The BDS has never asked Airbnb to remove a single short-term rental listing. They say that they are essentially giving folks a grace period because of the chaos within their own office. They're sorting these applications and the pendings and the renewals manually, and they don't want to penalize folks for the city's problems. But they, again, they are authorized to issue citations, and those have declined, from about 750,000 between 2017 and 2019 to 20,000 since 2020. Um, and they say that their enforcement is completely complaint based, and they don't have adequate staff to rigorously follow up. So it can take more than a year for the city to even begin to process one of these complaints that comes in. And again, they're kind of holding that whole process in abeyance at the moment because they recognize that the registry is so fouled up.
the findings in this investigation are vast. The apparent failures and shortcomings within the system are many. And when confronted with all of this, information approaching city officials about this, I mean, what explanation are they offering?
Well, they acknowledge, they have openly acknowledged. They This month the city held a meeting with Host to Host, which is a Airbnb host group, and the audience there, the folks that I talked to, were quite upset that this process isn't working, and the city pretty much acknowledged at the time that we got it right. that their enforcement of this data sharing agreement has been poor. That the registry is a mess at this point, and they don't have enough staff to do the enforcement. And the city brings in a lot of money through these rentals every year. It's probably this year it'll be close to $14 million in fees, but none of that money goes back to the bureau for enforcement. I mean, the citation money does, but again, that's been very little of that has been happening.
So where does the $14 million go to? The city's general fund, or where?
There's a portion for Portland, for the state of Oregon, for Travel Portland, um, and so Portland's share I think is about 6%. There's another 5.5% for the county, but 5 of the 6% of the revenues that come to the city of Portland, ironically, go into an affordable housing fund. Um, and Travel Portland gets quite a bit of its budget from Airbnb. So again, there are basic problems at BDS in enforcing this, but the city has kind of a financial incentive to continue allowing the system to operate the way it has. It's bringing in quite a bit of money, and if they began to crack down and took 1,000 listings off the platforms, that would impact this revenue stream, and that may be in part show why the this has been so slow to change. Am I answering your question there, Shane?
I think so. And is there any indication whatsoever that the problems here can be fixed in any sort of meaningful way?
So while we were reporting this story and finalizing it, the city sent notice to Airbnb that they were going to terminate um, the data sharing agreement, that it was broken, it was not worth putting the resources into trying to fix this thing when they have another alternative that they say is working. I would challenge that notion, but so they canceled the data sharing agreement, and that means that Airbnb has to head back to the same system as platforms like VRBO, and what VRBO is supposed to be doing is checking that any property that it lists are in the short-term registry and have a valid permit. VRBO isn't doing that. There are a lot of properties out there that that they don't list a permit number, and that's a requirement. The city's not enforcing that, but they say again they're having a tough time doing that when the registry itself is such a mess. Again, it's full of outdated information. The city needs to clean it up. Right now, that's a very manual process, and they're going through paper applications, sending out notices to property owners, and then if they don't respond, supposedly removing them from the registry. And they only have about 10 administrative staff who work on that. Apparently, they're putting some overtime into this, but they only spend a fraction of their time processing applications. So, how quickly this worked, they couldn't give me any deadline on when they'd have this registry cleaned up. They also plan to build an automated application portal, and they've committed to start that work in December, and say that'll take about 4 to 6 months. But in theory, that should better allow them to track application statuses, update the registry, send out materials. So in theory, that could work, but we'll have to see. It's nowhere near being put in place, and this massive backlog still stands. And they are still allowing the platforms to list properties without current permits. And none of this changes what hosts are advertising on the site. Again, there are a lot of hosts that will get a type A permit for 2 bedrooms, 5 guests or less, and then list their whole house, 4 bedrooms out on the site. The city says that due to federal regulations. It can't police the platforms themselves. It can only police the hosts. Um, and none of this addresses whether folks are complying with the rule to live in their property 9 months a year. It doesn't increase the enforcement resources that the bureau has. So the proof will be in the pudding, and it's still a long time coming. And I know that hosts are still very frustrated that this is the track that, or at least that the city is still allowing people to operate outside its rules.
And at this point in time, Ted, do we have a sense or an understanding of how short-term rentals in Portland are impacting the housing market overall? Like what data or studies or information do we have?
Yeah. So the city auditors, again, in the series of audits, 2018, 2019, I think 2021, had repeatedly recommended that the Portland Housing Bureau analyze that impact. And the Bureau hasn't done that. And they say they have been actually collecting some data on the number of short-term listings. They haven't done any analysis on that. And the Housing Bureau issues an annual report called the State of Housing, and they promise that some analysis will be forthcoming in the version that comes out next year. Um,
Mhm.
Part of the issue here is that the city and metro have taxpayers shouldering, almost $1 billion in bonds to fund new affordable housing production. And at the same time, we've effectively been telling residents to feel free to turn their homes into short-term rentals, unlicensed. One housing advocate told me that, in effect, that means taxpayers are subsidizing Airbnb. And they, again, think that housing in Portland should be first and foremost for people who live here. Um, and the exact effect is probably, it's difficult to tease out. The vacation rentals are really only a small fraction of um, the houses, condos, and apartments that are occupied by renters. The census figures put that at 134,000. Um, Portland's, the state of housing, I think, put the long-term rental market at something like 73,000. So it's a small fraction of that. And Eco Northwest, which many folks may be familiar with, economic consulting firm here in Portland, prepared a report in 2016, and they determined that these rentals had a negligible impact on Portland's affordability crisis because those properties are generally higher priced than low income and vulnerable folks could afford. But there are also academic studies that suggest, again, that the Airbnb effect is what it's called, is real. And there's one suggesting that it accounted for about 1/5 of annual rental price hikes and 1/7 of increasing housing prices nationwide. I mean, it depends, I guess, sort of what neighborhood you live in. Again, this gentrification effect, this has been an issue for cities around the country. Airbnb has 6 million listings in 100,000 cities. And if you have a vibrant tourism economy, you go into neighborhoods in some places and they are um, really dominated by, short-term rental listings. And that, has kind of this gentrification effect, is what some studies have found.
And Ted, I think I just have one final question to ask you today, and I wanted to get a better sense of: are there other cities in the U.S. that are better at regulating these short-term rentals, like Airbnb, enforcing violations? I mean, where are systems that actually appear to be working?
This has been a problematic issue globally, frankly. And Airbnb has pushed back on regulations everywhere it operates. But there are a variety of other cities that have much stricter regulations than Portland does. Some limit rentals in specific neighborhoods, the number of rentals in neighborhoods. Many have much tighter restrictions on the number of days that you're allowed to rent your house per year. Um, Although again, this is problematic for a lot of places. New York just implemented a licensing requirement. It had previously the rules there forced you to be in the house at all times when you were renting um, rooms out, and you could only rent 2 rooms to 2 guests. And again, you had to live there at the same time, but they didn't have any licensing requirement. They recently adopted that, and I think there's been a lot of concern that that will take, thousands upon thousands of listings off the market there. Um, I don't know that there's a shining example, but again, this has been a problem on the coast and elsewhere, and there are other cities that have brought this, under tighter control. Um, so the answer to that is yes.
Well, Ted, thank you so much for your time today. I've enjoyed digging into your reporting a little bit more. And for listeners, I'll include links to Ted's most recent investigation along with other articles and points of interest. Thanks so much for your time.
Hey, thank you, Shane.
Thanks so much for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like this show, give us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find the show. And tell a friend. Help spread the word. The best way to support our journalism and stories like this one is with a subscription to the Oregonian OregonLive. You can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time.